just some quick logistical check-ins. The exit, you'll want to use the same one you came in down the breezeway. There are all-gender restrooms if you take a right and go down the hall just a little bit. We have folks on hand to help out with any accessibility needs that occur during the event. So if there's anything you need to make this space and this event feel more accessible, if those folks could raise their hands, I believe it's Haley and Leanne. Yeah, thank you. So just seek them out if there's anything that comes up. We also have sort of safety and de-escalation team on hand, so if there's anything that happens that leaves you feeling unsafe and like you need someone to step in and help de-escalate, we have folks on hand for that as well. And that'll be Haley and as well as Kate, I believe. So if those folks could raise their hand. And Kat as well. Yeah, thank you. Invite you now to please turn to silence your phones so that there aren't interruptions during the event. Feel free to use your phones for social media if you would like. We're using the hashtag OregonDA for the people, and you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Feel free to take videos, take pictures. If you don't want to appear on video, you can talk with one of our accessibility folks, and we can try to help you with that. If you have, as I mentioned before, there are note cards at the ends of of each pew. You can use those to write questions that you'd like to have addressed to the DA candidates in the future. Jacqueline, if you could raise your hand, we'll be collecting those. And we want to move from there into a land acknowledgement and into sort of the grounding in some of the history that makes an event like this necessary. So we start with land acknowledgements to recognize that everything we do and all the stories we tell about ourselves and the work that we're doing is grounded in a history of land theft and of genocide, and that we are currently occupying the rightful and ancestral lands of many groups, including the Multnomah, Clackamas, Cowlitz, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many others who lived along the Columbia River and across the Northwest. And today, descendants of those groups make up the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated tribes of the Siletz Indians, the Chinook Nation, the Cowlitz Nation, and again, many others. It's, I think, especially important to recognize that history for an event like today that's focused on addressing the violence inherent in the system of policing and prosecution in our criminal legal system, because our criminal legal system evolved alongside and as an integral part of that history, where that legal system was used to justify and enforce the theft of land, the theft of labor and of life. And throughout, there's never been a moment in our history where our criminal legal system was not used as a sort of implement of terror and control for our most marginalized groups. And that is still the case today. And police and prosecution, in many ways, they are the carriers of that legacy of violence that has taken so many forms throughout our history, with mass incarceration and police violence today being one of the key ways that direct control and of marginalized communities is enacted. So every demand within our platform as OregonDA for the People is tied to a direct history of violence. And we want to ground ourselves in a recognition that we need to get beneath sort of heady discussions of policy into like what those mean for actual people's lives, the history of violence against our most marginalized communities. friends and our neighbors in this community need to have these issues addressed for their safety. These are real lives, and that's who is represented on this stage. And needs to inform every conversation that we have around what safety and accountability and justice look like for our communities. Every demand is also tied to a legacy of survival and resistance to that violence, and we're accountable to those legacies. We want to honor those legacies and build on those legacies of survival. That's who we are accountable to, is to the folks who have been resisting every way that state violence is implemented against our communities. So we want to hold that throughout the event and make sure that that truth is sort of at the rock, at the center of everything we're addressing. And that also means that we, as the Oregon DA for the People campaign, know the importance of the DA's office as a place where we can dramatically reduce harm to our communities. We also understand that that's not the ending point, and that it's the violence inherent in this system that we are here to address, and begin chipping away at the power of those institutions and locating our answers for justice and safety within, like believing that communities themselves have the answers to those questions, and we don't have to turn to police and prosecutors for those answers, and that we can't be kept safe by a system that was designed to protect those stealing land and labor and life. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ty, who is co-facilitating with me, to give a quick introduction to who we are as Oregon DA for the People, where this movement came from, and what we're hoping to accomplish.
Thank you. So yeah, as Jojo said, we are accountable to the people that have been resisting the impacts of the criminal justice system, who are gathered up here. And the first group that sort of really gave us that call was Pacific Northwest Family Circle, which is a group of really strong and amazing moms and grandmas and loved ones of people that have been murdered by police brutality and violence. And coming sort of alongside them or in support of them, our organization, Showing Up for Racial Justice Portland, started to dream about what it would look like to actually hold the most powerful position in the criminal justice system accountable to these community members. So what we commit to doing, and hopefully with all of you who are here, is continuing to pressure candidates to listen to the community. We are not endorsing a candidate, we're focusing on the issues that impact our community members and our friends. And we are hoping to build a movement that extends beyond the election so we can continue to ask for that accountability. So why district attorney? I don't think that we have to tell many of you in this audience, but district attorneys do have the power to investigate police misconduct, racial profiling, to determine whether people are released after arrest, whether they're held in jail before trial, the amount of bail, how and what evidence is turned over to the defense, when to summon a grand jury or when not to, the culture of prosecutors, what charges they bring against our community members or drawn, and options for treatment or diversion that are offered or not offered, and even when to charge death sentences. So that's why we're in this fight. So as far as why now, this election in May is one opportunity that we've gathered here to show the power of our community in who the DA should answer to. This is an elected position that has run uncontested for a very, very long time in Oregon. 78% of the races were uncontested in the past 10 years, and 17 of those positions are appointed, so by the predecessor. And we're also a part of a really growing movement to transform prosecutors' practices and really create that material change that Jojo is speaking to. That's fueled by abolitionists, that's fueled by the Black Lives Matter movement, that's fueled by WIN specifically in DA races across the country to get folks in office who are listening to the community and who are trying to reduce the harm of the criminal justice system. So what we were hoping to do, we put together this platform, which has input from many organizations. And before we start and hear from our candidates, we wanted to make sure that they knew what we're about and what we're looking for. So we have a couple of different demands, but I would love it if there are folks from the audience who want to help it be a little more participatory here. Like the part in bold is what we want from the district attorney. There's so much more that informs those points, and we can talk to you more about them. But if somebody would be willing to stand up and sort of shout out for us the demand in bold.
Stop targeting Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant communities.
Thank you. And what we want? Somebody else, what we want?
We want a district attorney who will use their power to end the disproportionate harm caused to immigrants and communities of color and indigenous communities within the criminal legal system.
Decline to prosecute individuals with mental health conditions.
We want a district attorney who will decline to prosecute mental health and to support funding for trauma-informed, community-based treatment and diversion programs that function outside of the criminal legal system.
Treat kids like kids.
We want a district attorney who is committed to ending the school-to-prison pipeline by discouraging the presence of law enforcement officers in schools and refusing to prosecute youth for misdemeanors and school-based arrests.
Committed to ending mass incarceration.
We want a district attorney who will support the redistribution of funds to public assistance programs such as housing, mental health care, education, and job training to help prevent some of the root causes of why people become incarcerated.
Hold police and prosecutors accountable.
We want a district attorney who will take a stand against police misconduct and violence by ensuring that unethical officers are removed from the police force and the criminal legal system. We want a district attorney who will require accountability and transparency from prosecutors.
Decriminalize houselessness, sex work, and drug use.
We want a district attorney who acknowledges and apologizes for the harm that the war on drugs and tough on crime policies have had on communities of color and poor and working class communities. We want a district attorney who will decline to prosecute crimes of survival.
Thank you. And so we wanted to make sure that as we hand it over to our candidates, that they know that the district attorney answers to us, to our community. And so if you are from or love and support these organizations, we're going to read them off. You can cheer, you can stand up, you can clap, you can stomp your feet, whatever you so desire to show that power. Here with us we have Pacific Northwest Family Circle. Metro
Good afternoon.
My name is Kirsten Nadeau, and I really want to thank all of those organizations and for, sorry. Tell me to do that. Okay, so again, I'm just going to start over. My name is Kirsten Nadeau, and I really want to thank all of these organizations for bringing us all together and for creating this space for us to have this really important conversation. You know, I have also noticed that these types of elections generally are an anointment process, and they are not run, and so many people in the community never know how much power the district attorney has. And so for me, just a little bit about me, I started my legal career as a defense attorney for several years, and then was a deputy district attorney, and I spent the last year now as an assistant attorney general. And so I can tell you that I have really seen this system from all sides. And you know, the reason that I'm so passionate about this race and these issues is that, you know, I think I can say that I've seen the system work sometimes, but more often, and the cases that really stick with me, is when I've seen the system just utterly fail. And that looks very different, you know, from case to case, but you know, that's my motivation for being here. That's why I think this conversation is so important. If elected, I would be working to change so many of the issues that I hope to talk about today. And I just really want to kind of take this last minute to say I really want to thank everybody for participating, and I really look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
My name is Mike Schmidt, pronouns he, him, his. Thank you for having us here to have these great conversations. Really appreciate the energy in this room and the introduction from our hosts. I thought that was really meaningful and important. So thank you for that. I'm running for district attorney because I think, and I know it's in this room, there's an urgency right now to reform our criminal justice system. This is not a conversation that we should wait for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years and keep making incremental changes around the margins. And I have a lot of hope that now is the time. And I think all of you in this room are evidence of that the community is waking up to how powerful a position this is in our communities. And that's why I started off this campaign by telling you right where I stand against the death penalty, a failed policy that does not keep our communities safe, that is costly, that's racially biased, and that frankly sometimes we get wrong. Many of you in this audience have seen my platform. It is full of the policies that I hope to discuss in this race, but many of what you highlighted here. How can we decriminalize poverty? How can we treat addiction like the health issue that it is? How can we hold our criminal justice system accountable to the people and make it transparent? I got my start as a high school teacher in the public schools of New Orleans, where I saw firsthand my students as victims of crime, witnesses to crime, sometimes the children of incarcerated parents. The school-to-prison pipeline is real, and we need to dismantle it. Absolutely. So, from there, I went on to be a deputy DA here in our community in Multnomah County. I worked for victims to get them restitution. I worked in drug courts, and I learned that people should not be defined by the worst moment in their lives, and that we can, if we give them the resources they need, they can improve. And for the last 5 years, I've led the Criminal Justice Commission, which leads our state in reforming our system so that we know we can use less prison and keep our communities safe. So thank you for having this important conversation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ethan Knight, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon to have this discussion, to begin a dialogue that I hope will last for 6 months, that helps us all understand the importance of this race and this position, and most importantly, the reason I'm running, the importance of community involvement. Right now, I'm a federal prosecutor here in Portland, and I handle a host of different kinds of crimes there. I prosecute mainly right-wing extremism, counterintelligence, espionage, those types of offenses. And I've done that for around 12 years. For 8 years prior to that, I was a deputy DA here in Multnomah County, where I handled a range of offenses. I helped create our community court program in downtown Portland, prosecuted environmental crimes, and virtually everything else. But beyond that experience, more importantly, the reason I'm running is because I love this community. I was raised here in Portland by a single mother. I'm raising my kids here in this town, and I volunteered in all manner of ways over the last 2 decades in the legal community to provide legal services to the poor and access to justice, with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Portland, and with the Oregon State Bar to ensure that we have diversity within our ranks as attorneys, and to ensure that we are acting fair and equitably to all as practicing lawyers in this state. Now, beyond that, let me briefly tell you why I'm running. I am running because I want to ensure the community has a seat at the table when we confront our most pressing problems. And what does that mean? First of all, it means that with our low-level offenders, the folks who don't make it to the newspaper, but we see every day, we use and employ programs that work to address addiction and mental illness in our communities. Community court, mental health court, drug courts, diversion programs that take a lot of time and aren't as simple and easy as simply sending someone to jail, but hopefully stop recidivism and get folks to a place where they are in a better place and they don't have contact with the system. And lastly, and most importantly, I want a system where the community is always at the table even when we don't agree. Thank you.
And we're going to hear from our community members who bring us all the power in this fight. And we're going to start with Donna Hayes.
Okay.
We love you.
Hello, candidates. I'm the one that's been emailing you all, Twitter, Facebook. It's me. My name is Donna Hayes, and I'm a member of Pacific Northwest Family Circle. The Pacific Northwest Family Circles are family members who have lost loved ones killed or brutalized by police. We are fighting for change through the change of leadership and laws, and we will have those changes. I am the grandmother of Quantis Hayes, who was murdered by Andrew Hurst of the Portland Police on February 9, 2017. He was surrounded by 17 cops. They all giving him conflicting orders, and one decided to shoot. This was not that cop's first time using his AR-15. This wasn't his first time. Next, my family dealt with the DA, not a deputy DA, but Underhill himself. He lied to them, saying the rumors that my grandson was shot 6 times was not true. He was shot 3 times in the chest. That came from his mouth. He said he had someone in the office with the ME, medical examiner. And we got the death certificate. He was shot twice in the chest, once in the head. So the DA race is pretty important to me. We need honesty. My question is a compound question. One relating to the grand jury, another dealing with the cops. Why are there secret grand juries for me, but me and my lawyer can't come in? And the cops have a grand jury hearing where they, their lawyer, and the union can come. If you see something wrong with if you see something wrong with this, what's your plans to change it? Second part of the question. We know that there are police officers currently on the force who have acted unethically, engaged in misconduct, perpetuated violence, but they are still intruding on our communities and being called to testify on behalf of the state. The police officer who killed my grandson, Andrew Hurst, had already been involved in a police shooting that left Merrill Hatch dead. Merrill Hatch should not be dead. My grandson should not be dead. Andrew Hurst should have been flagged as dangerous and unreliable the first time he shot a member of our community. Or, I'm going to give you another example, Mark Kruger, who was proving himself to be biased and a Nazi sympathizer. Are you going to flag these cops if you are elected?
Thank you for that question. It's good to see you again. And I appreciate, and again, I'm sorry for you and your family's loss and that tragedy. Your first question was, why are grand juries secret and what to do about that? So first of all, I think it was great when we saw legislation passed that grand juries should all be recorded. And I think as DA, I would continue to record grand juries, make those transcripts public to the community so people can see what's happening inside the grand jury. Furthermore, I think we can do even more than that to make investigations transparent. I think putting together an investigation of and a synopsis for the community to actually see how the case was built, what steps were taken to put that together. So we're not just releasing a 400-page transcript of back and forth words that happen in a grand jury setting, but you actually have a full packet of how the investigation happened. And furthermore, I think I would call for those investigations to be transparent and conducted by a third party. I think in the event of officer-involved shootings, it's appropriate to ask another agency to come in and work and investigate those cases, because we all know that agencies that work together on a day-to-day basis can form relationships. I think the Attorney General's office could come in and investigate officer-involved shootings in our community so that the community can be assured that there's a fair process and that it's transparent and legitimate. The second part of your question had to do with police acting unethically and committing misconduct in our community, or whether or not, as district attorney, we would use them as witnesses. Absolutely any officer that displays any kind of acts of bias or show themselves to have a bias, they can't be trusted as witnesses on cases. So what happens in the district attorney's office would be we would mark them so that we do not call them on cases because we know we can no longer trust their testimony. And when police officers can't be trusted and be called as witnesses, that changes their ability to work cases in our community. And I think that sends a message to them that we're only going to rely on police officers that we can trust to testify in our cases, and we can trust what they say.
Let me just say, if you have to mistakes, I'm sorry. I think a lot of times in the criminal justice system, we try and solve problems and look for answers, but there's no way to have answers when you lose a loved one. Let me turn to the questions. First, with respect to the grand jury, I think obviously transparency is key, and we have some ways that you get transcripts and get information, but I think it's more than that. I think there are other ways to try and get information out. You know, about 15 years ago, Mike Schrunk, when he was DA, used something called a public inquest, and I helped him with this, where after an officer-involved shooting, there was actually testimony and it was publicized, and people were in a courtroom where they got to hear all the evidence and the live witnesses that the grand jury saw. And I think that's a tool that maybe isn't used enough, so that everyone in the community can actually get some insight into these tragic events and see what happened. So that's something we haven't done and could do. Now, in talking about officers and unethical officers, when you have situations where does the DA's office use them? A couple thoughts. I think first, obviously, if anyone acts unethically, if they are doing something where they're lying in their past, they shouldn't be witnesses. That's the law. In federal court, we identify those things up front, we disclose them to everyone, and oftentimes they're not getting on the witness stand. But I think there's more than that for the elected DA. I think it's not just that policy, but it's standing up and reminding everyone in the community that whether you agree or not, only ethical, honest conduct is tolerated. And reiterating that message in public out in the community, and as the leader and the chief law enforcement officer, the county matters, and that's what I do. Thank you.
Ms. Hayes, I really want to thank you for sharing your story and for using your loss to help change the dialogue and be in this space. As a mother, I can't imagine what that must feel like. I think that your question raises really important issues about our system, about trust and transparency and accountability. And I know those are kind of buzzwords, so I kind of want to break that down a little bit more. When law enforcement is charged with investigating one of its own, I think it automatically brings up all of these issues that it almost looks like it could never be fair. And as the elected district attorney, I would be charged with, I've been given that responsibility to conduct those investigations. So I want you to know that I would take that very seriously and do everything in my power to make that process as transparent and independent as possible. And what that looks like is the district attorney being informed at the outset of any kind of incident like this, following the investigation every step of the way, and looking for, at any point, is this process no longer transparent and accountable? And do we need to bring in an outside party to finish that investigation and conclude that investigation? The second part I want to talk about is the grand juries. That is, I think, really important. I echo what Mike said about kind of releasing all of the grand jury recordings and then taking it a step further and actually, giving this community my own conclusions that are in a kind of easy to, it's not going to be 400 pages, it's going to be my own conclusions about what happened. Thank you.
Okay, I have read probably as many transcripts that there's on the police department, and they all read the same. Okay, it seems like the district attorney protects the police. That's what my question. My question is, how come their grand jury hearing is different than mine? And number two, okay, you was talking about the fact in the police. How can we make that transparent so we can know who they are?
So the first question is, how can the police process be different than the community members' process in the grand jury? And I think that's something to look at. I'm glad that you brought that up, because it shouldn't be any different. Police officers should not have special rights or be treated differently than anybody else in the public. So I think I'm glad you brought that up. That's something that I would consider and think about how, what leverage the district attorney can have to do that differently. And people should be treated the same no matter what. Your second question is about releasing officer names that aren't going to be called as witnesses. And so that's, again, another issue that we have to look into. I know there's some jurisdictions, when I look at DAs across the country, in Philadelphia and other places, that have that practice. And I think we have to look at the laws in Oregon and whether or not we can do that. If we can't do it pursuant to the laws, then we should change those laws. I think the public has a right to know that if their police officers can be trustworthy in who they are. And what we don't want to have happen is an officer leave one jurisdiction because if I'm the DA, I don't call them as a witness, and then they go work in a different jurisdiction. And so I think the public does have a right to know, and I think if we are not able to do that with the laws, like I said, that we should change that. And I think just as a general theme, is really kind of holding police officers accountable is absolutely, the thing we have to do, and making our system transparent. And so I think looking at things like racial profiling and tracking data and numbers to see what's happening in our community, because I think that can also show us patterns and practices that we should be looking at to make sure that our community members are not being targeted and that they're being safe, which is something that I've gotten to work on at the district, or at the Criminal Justice Commission, as we're tracking profiling incidents. So it's about transparency, it's about collecting information and data at an aggregate level, but it's also specifically looking at police officers and keeping that out.
Well, I think the first answer when we talk about the grand jury and the grand jury process is ensuring that the grand jury looks like the community. I mean, that's important in any part of the process where you have the public participating in making decisions about other people. It's ensuring again and again, it's the same reason you want to have a district attorney's office that looks like the community, because when those important decisions get made, they need to reflect everyone's backgrounds, diverse experiences, diversity of people. So I think that's where that begins in that grand jury process when you ask about why should it look one way for one outcome or one person and another way for somebody else. So I think that's where we start. I think with law enforcement, it gets to a little bit of Mike saying if the law allows, the DA's office can release and should release whatever information it can. But if the DA's office can't release information about officers, what it should do then is be as transparent with every piece of information that it does have and it controls. And that gets back to what I was talking about a few moments ago. Maybe there are times we have a public inquest or a public hearing that the DA's office controls, where we have witnesses come forward and people get to look at and examine for themselves to understand what happened in one of these events. So that's something we can examine beyond that. But I think at its core, the most important thing is ensuring that the office itself and the jurors and grand juries we impanel look like the community. Because that way we'll have credibility in those decisions when everyone's at the table.
So Ms. Hayes, I want to start off by saying, I apologize that it maybe taken us a couple of times to get to your questions. I think these are tough questions, and these go to what we've all been talking about in terms of trust and accountability to the community. The differences that the system treats police officers and the general public, they need to be re-examined. And I don't think I have a great answer for your question, and I apologize for that. I appreciate you bringing it up because I think it has raised such a good conversation between us and will allow us to continue to have this dialogue and work towards a more equitable and just system. So with that said, I want to go to your the differences between police in front of the grand jury and everybody else. And that is a system where it just fundamentally doesn't look fair. But we need to keep building on a system that is better. And so what I want to do as district attorney is, after the end of the investigation and the grand jury, I want to impanel another grand jury to investigate the process and come back to me and say, this is how we can improve and this is how we can do better. And then, as to your second question, in terms of releasing officers' names, I think that this is something that this community needs to keep working towards. And this involves the district attorney saying, I'm going to come to the table and have this conversation, and I want to hear from the community on this. And then I'm going to go to law enforcement and say, look, this is what the community is saying, and where can we improve that and make this process more transparent. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to throw this out. Okay, what's wrong with a preliminary hearing instead of a grand jury hearing?
Maybe just like 20 or 30 seconds to give a quick response to that.
So in general, preliminary hearings are great because they open it up to the community and to the public to have the hearing in front of everybody, have the witnesses be examined. In these specific cases, I think that could pose some challenges, but it's definitely something to look into.
Yeah, it's a great process. The reality is we're bound by the Oregon statutes that require a grand jury if someone is being examined or determined to have committed a crime. But that preliminary hearing is like the public inquest I talked about. If people can see it and lay eyes on the witnesses and maybe assess those facts, that helps with the transparency piece. So when there's an opportunity for a preliminary hearing, I found in the federal system, it's great.
And I just want to, I want to go back to the, so I guess it sounds a little bit disingenuous, but I want to have a special grand jury to investigate this process and come back to recommendations for me, and if those recommendations say we need to work towards having preliminary hearings, then that's what I want to do.
Thank you. And for future rounds, I think if there is a follow-up question, we'll give each 30 seconds for your responses to those follow-ups. And next we'll have Amanda with Portland Freedom Fund.
Last year, we've been helping to bail out our Black, Brown, and Indigenous neighbors from local jails in Multnomah County, Washington County, Clackamas County, and a few others counties. This is done mostly through individual contributions from our community. We focus our efforts on these populations because it's well documented these communities are disproportionately targeted and harmed by policing and the criminal justice system. And for instance, Multnomah County, we're made up of 24% are non-white residents. Multnomah County Jail is full, 37% non-white. So there's quite a difference there. My question's a little broader though. On average, there are just under 1,100 people caged in the Multnomah County Jail on any given day. 52% of them are pre-trial. They've not been convicted of the crimes for which they're being accused of. That's over half. Not been convicted. Many of them, if not most of them, would be free if they could afford the bail. The bail amount is time for their release. If elected, what steps would you take to reduce the rate of pretrial incarceration in Multnomah County to assure our citizens are not pressured into pleading against their best interests and can prepare their case from a position of freedom?
Before response, as I mentioned, we've had a couple of audience members saying they're having a little bit of trouble hearing, so just if everybody can remember to hold the mics close so they won't.
The issue of first cash bail and excessive fines is a significant one, and it disproportionately penalizes the poor. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem in the criminal justice system of the United States, not just pre-trial. We talk about people who are on probation and don't pay their fines. That disproportionately affects the poor, and that's a significant concern of mine as someone who has spent a lot of time working on legal aid and a lot of time working with an organization that promotes access to justice. So I say that to sort of frame the issue of what do we do with pretrial detention. So to your question, how do we reduce or address that 52%? I think the key gets to how can we get those folks access to services that are not inside the jail prior to trial and access to assistance prior to trial so that before they meet with their lawyer, when they meet with their lawyer, they have an opportunity to prepare for their own defense and also address many of those addiction and mental health issues we know are present for people who are coming into the jail. So they have an access point to services that work prior to entering the system. Because I think that's a better outcome than jail than for virtually everyone except our most violent offenders.
Thank you so much for your question. So in my experience, I saw this representing court-appointed clients, and I would see those who were charged with low-level offenses and could not afford bail. I would meet with them, and generally they were entering a plea within hours or days and being sentenced regardless of whether they believed or agreed or had a defense, believed that they committed a crime. So this issue does not produce any kind of justice or equitable results. For me, kind of seeing it on the other side, you know, the issue when people don't show up to court and you have kind of this repeating cycle of somebody who's not there, warrant issues, and then they come back to the jail. They may end up, sometimes the cycle repeats itself, they may end up ultimately spending more time in jail than they're actually sentenced to. And again, that is not equitable, that's not justice, and it's a drain on our system and community. So, you know, I think this community has had in the past, you know, more significant pretrial release services. That's something that the next DA needs to build upon and support, and ultimately work towards reserving cash bail for our most serious and violent offenders. Thank you.
Eliminate cash bail. And I got to work with you and others around the state on exactly that. In 2017, the legislature passed legislation that was co-written by myself and our agency in the governor's office to empower the Public Safety Task Force to look at this exact issue and make recommendations to the legislature on how we can get rid of cash out of our system. Right now, a judge asks 3 questions about whether or not someone should be held. Are you dangerous? Will you show up again? And do you have $500? One of those things doesn't belong there. Whether or not you have any money in your bank account should have no bearing whatsoever on whether or not you are held pre-trial. Washington, D.C. doesn't use cash bail. Alaska got rid of cash bail. New Jersey got rid of cash bail. California got rid of cash bail. There is no reason, especially in Oregon, that we can't get rid of cash bail, because we have an advantage that a lot of them didn't. We do not have a bail bonds industry, which is amazing. And we should use that because we can have this conversation. We should absolutely eliminate cash bail in our system. There are other ways to protect our community. And the research shows cash does not make anybody more likely to show up or not. A lot of times it's somebody else posting it on behalf of the person. It has nothing to do with whether or not someone should show up. Get rid of cash bail.
How y'all doing? My name is Terrence Hayes. This is Darrell. We represent Liberation Literacy. Our position is unique in that we've both been incarcerated. And we, as an organization, our goal is to empower people during their incarceration to make sure that when they get home, that they have the knowledge and the understanding not to reoffend. So my perspective is different in that the current DA was the deputy district attorney who convicted me, right? He was the DA by the time I went up for appeals and requested a reduction on the gun minimum. And he actually helped me and did that. My auntie don't like that. This is mine. She don't like me giving him a little kudos. But I'll tell the truth. He did that. And he was also the DA that failed extremely in holding Andrew Hurst accountable to the murder of Taquanis Hayes. And so my experience is different. A lot of things that I feel like people ask you guys, I think you guys answer them with a little bit of fluff because you're not really in control of some of those things, but you can do your best to influence them, but you're not really in control of them, okay? Money stuff, budget stuff, you guys really don't control that stuff. That's just, it's crazy that you still do your best instead of just saying, look, that ain't changed in 400 years, it ain't gonna change. Okay? So once you try it, and I understand why. For us, and for me particularly, there is no more powerful position, and I think I'll even say in this county or in this state, in the DA over the control of lives of people, especially Black, brown, indigenous, and disenfranchised people. you guys can try y'all best to talk about a power, but it is a power. It is a power that really is a dangerous thing in the hands of an individual. But you guys are up here basically saying that I acknowledge that it's an extremity of power. I would even imply that it might be too much power, but I want that power. So when you do that, that's a concern for me, right? That's it. Why, you know, one of my questions would be like, you guys won't change, but historically DAs haven't really put that on the table, right? So if you guys haven't seen it happen, and you mentioned some examples of some things that shit, my auntie kind of like this, I'm gonna be careful. Post you up and that. But why, you know, one of my questions, and it is two-part, why do you want that power? Why do you want to become part of something that is systematically, the DA has been at the top part of oppressing people, right? Having the ability to decide inconsistently. You guys have inconsistently decided how people will be charged and dealt with. Now, maybe as a federal prosecutor, you got a little bit more leeway and consistency because of the way things set up. But I know personally that a state DA, I went to jail for attempted murder. I want to put this on the table so y'all can understand the extremity and the passion that I speak for. I was 19 years old. I made a bad decision as a 19-year-old, and I was held accountable to that. I'm not judging that. The problem I have is there are white men and there are white women that are also guilty of the same thing that didn't get 14 years. Right? So for me, I'm not speaking as a person who sees the injustice and want to change it. I was a victim of it. Not a victim of being held accountable for what I did. I was a victim of an inconsistent system. So you guys are up here wanting the power to control the lives of people who make bad choices at times. I don't know. I want to know why you want that power. It amazes me that you want something that has historically not been good for you. Right? You want that power for yourself. I think it's true. And the second part of my question is as genuine as you can be, what different? I experienced a DA who threw me under the bus, right, when I was going to trial, who then showed compassion towards me when I needed a little bit of time back. It wasn't much, I still did 13 years. And then totally had disregard for the life that was lost in protecting the police. I do not believe, from my heart of heart, I believe it's almost impossible for y'all to work day in and day out with police officers and then decide if one of those police officers offend that you're really ready to stand up against a police union. And I think that's what we're not talking about. Is that as we get this lip service about change, none of y'all has really said, but hey guys, we got a police union that's real. You know what I mean? That's powerful, and we need to deal with that too. So I'll just state it again. My question is, why do you want the power of my life in your hand? That's important. I really want to know that. And historically, based on what DAs have done, why do you think once you're in that position, you're going to do anything different?
Okay.
Thank you very much for your question. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry, I'm going to hold up the mic. Sorry. I think that first, let me start with the first question. The history of this office, of the whole criminal justice system, is not something that one person is going to change on their own, right? I think I've been asking myself that question about why would I want this power? I think it's a great question. You know, when I looked at this office and the history of this office, actually applied to work for this office, went into that room, looked on the wall and saw white men all the way across. And then people in the community, when the current DA announced that he was not going to run, started asking, you know, who is going to be different, who's going to bring a different perspective, because it's not going to change the history, and it's probably not going to result in the kind of change that I think this office needs overnight or on day one, right? But in terms of why I want this power, you know, it's because I think that I can bring a different perspective and work towards that change. And I know that that's, you know, unfortunately that will not be evident until that person is there, right? You know, so I can talk all day, but that's not going to change. And then I think the second part of your question is standing up against the police unions. You know, at the end of the day, this is a law enforcement position, and the law enforcement has to work with the police union, and there is a serious disconnect there. I can see that definitely. And so I think, but what's important about this position is, you know, we've started this dialogue today, or actually I think it's been started in the past, but this dialogue today is going to help with that. And the district attorney needs to be held accountable, not just during the election cycle, but all of the time. And that involves bringing the community into the office. You know, this, I'm getting the time, but historically we make all these decisions behind closed doors, and that needs to change. You know, it started to change with the awareness of the power of this office, but fundamentally that needs to change.
So, why I want the power of this office. When I was a high school teacher in New Orleans, I saw firsthand with my students how this affected their lives. I had a student who was the happiest student you've ever seen. He was bubbly, he was always, I remember I got him a book of poetry. He memorized those poems and walked around to every single girl in the school trying to, you know, get her to go out and date with him. He was the most happy kid you've ever met. And then one day he comes to my classroom and he's just down. His affect is just down. And I said to him, I said, Evans, what's going on, man? What's going on? And he said, you know, I was arrested this past weekend. And he described to me what happened, that he walked up on the scene of another man down on the ground with police with guns drawn, and that they turned their guns on him, and they told him to get down. And he was 14 years old. He spent the entire weekend in solitary confinement in the jail. And he told me the only thing he could do to keep his sanity was to count the braids on his head over and over again. His affect never improved the rest of that school year. He had a flat affect after that. They found out after the fact in New Orleans that the police officer, because of a dash cam, planted some drugs in his back pocket. All the charges were dismissed, so he didn't have to go through that. But he still spent the weekend in solitary confinement, and he never recovered from that. That's why I want this position and this power, because I've seen how it impacts people's lives. And I've seen that it can be used to positively impact their lives and do something different. Will you stand up to police, and what do you think about that? When I first met with the family circle, Irene asked me from across the table, she said, "Aren't you scared?" I said, "Yeah, I am. This is a scary thing to step out and take this on and take on this challenge, because there are deep feelings and deep roots on all sides of this issue. But what I've done at the Criminal Justice Commission is work with all of these people. And you can do that with data, you can do that with research, but you can also bring people together at the table so they can talk. And that's what I hope to do.
To your first question, why? You know, I think the one thing I've learned in 20 years of doing this is none of us is as important as we think we are. I think when I was a young prosecutor, I thought I had the answers. I would walk in the courtroom, I would assume I was doing the right thing, but I wouldn't really think about the effect it had. The longer I do it, the more humility I think I have in the job, and I realize I don't have all the answers. And when you affect people's lives, not only is it tremendous power, you have to recognize there's a lot of nuance there. And that it's not simple. It's not always yes or no, or there's an obvious answer, and then people make mistakes. And honestly, that's one thing that's changed with me over time as a prosecutor. Now, to your question, what would I do different and how would I use that power in the system that we know has made mistakes historically? Like, there's part of me that's an optimist, and that's why I want the job, because I believe we can always do better. Doesn't mean we will, but it means I will listen and be in the community, trying to do better. And if you're concerned about standing up to the police union or anything else, all I can tell you in this job, I've sat across from terrorist spies, I've had right-wing extremists follow me home and threaten to kill me. If I disagree with the police union, I don't have a problem with that. I'll do what's right, and it could be the shortest tenure of a DA ever. May not, but I'll do it, and that's it.
Yeah, I just do again, contextually, I'm a felon.
Microphone, please.
Contextually, I'm a felon, right? And I always tell my aunt and everybody I talk to, like, I think that the dumbest thing in the world is for people to talk about criminal reform without having a conversation with criminals. Right? Like, how do you talk about doing better by the people that reform would affect, and nobody's coming to the table with those people? Right, so again, liberation and literacy, we at the table, right? We are those people. Do you guys, with me kind of creating that, do you think that that's something that as the DA, maybe in dealing with some reform or addressing some issues, that you'll be willing to sit at the people that's mostly, nobody in here that's never been arrested is more affected by your decisions than me. That's just a fact. I don't care how they feel. They're not, because I ate from the power that exists. Do you think you'll be willing to come to the table with ex-cons who are being effective and serious in the community to work with those people, not just empower another non-for-profit that become gatekeepers, right? You create a non-for-profit to help criminals, you have none of them involved in what you do, and then you get power and authority, and you're just another gatekeeper. Do you think that you're willing to create panels and boards with ex-cons and people that's in those communities to help out with the decision making that you guys have?
Of course. I mean, I think the biggest piece missing, not only what you alluded to, in the criminal justice space, is we don't talk about what real reentry means, and we don't think about it. And I didn't used to think about this until I started talking to a lot of families who had come through the criminal justice system of defendants and victims, and it took me years to get it. What happens when everyone leaves the room and the DA's on to the next case? 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And so that's why I think we need to rethink what expungement means for the long term. Maybe alter that, give some new opportunities there so that somebody trying to get housing 5 years down the road isn't encumbered, somebody trying to get a job. Those simple barriers, if you have to check a box on an application for some kind of federal assistance, financial aid, or college, we need to rethink what that means, because we own all of these problems. And I think what I want to do is think about what does this mean long-term for the community so the issue isn't so divisive and we can start solving the problems of the criminal justice system and what it means for the community as a whole. So absolutely, that's an easy call as the committee. The harder one is, what does this look like in 4 or 5, 6 years down the road, and can we make some of those changes?
Yes, also, I agree. And as someone who has represented defendants in the system, this is absolutely a failing when I have had clients who are repeatedly coming back and the system is not providing any solution, is not keeping the community safer, is not providing any kind of reentry or rehabilitation, which is its main charge. So absolutely to that question. And then, I think it involves more, it's gotta be more than just kind of community engagement and again, opening those doors with what I was talking about. This is a long-term process that, this district attorney needs to reach out to those communities, to the community who has been, who has been incarcerated before, and ask them, how can we do better?
You come to the table, come sit at my table. So I got a platform out there in the audience, and one of the things you'll see is on day one, I want a panel, a community oversight committee, to come in and look at every single policy in the district attorney's office. And that includes people who have been formerly incarcerated. It includes health experts, so we can start looking about our criminal justice system from a health lens instead of a punitive lens. social workers. We need to bring everybody to the table. I was just sitting the other day at a cafeteria with a man who did 30 years for murder. And he told me about his experience getting out. He's been out for 4 years now, and he can't get a job because he has some medical issues, but he was working. But he's just trying to get his life back together. But what he's doing is he's actually volunteering his time, going back into prisons and doing Toastmasters. And he's trying to give back any way that he can. And so, absolutely, I think a lot of people re-entering into our society they want to do the right thing, they're untapped resources, and they, like you said, know better than anybody else what should be good for them and what would have worked or what did work for them.
Sorry, before we move on, just wanted to jump onto that. Want to note, if that is the commitment that you're making, we want to know exactly how that's going to happen, and not just inviting folks to your table, but going out to the tables of the community members who have been living through these issues, doing the work. We want to know, and also not just on day one, but to inform your entire campaign, how we want to know, and we're going to be following up, how are you actively embedding yourself into these communities and inviting them in. I also wanted to say, the other two candidates sort of spoke a little bit to the police union issue and resisting police, but we didn't hear anything from you, Mike, about that. So I want to know your thoughts on how you would address that conflict of interest between prosecutors and the police union.
Yeah, on the police union issue, I mean, absolutely, prosecutors and police officers work together. That's part of the job. But, working with them and then also inviting other groups from outside, if we're investigating the police, I think it's completely acceptable, and I would request that other people come in to aid in those investigations. But we will be working with police officers absolutely on a day-to-day basis. And, it's an important part of the job, but holding them accountable at the same time.
My name is Sarah Radcliffe, and I work at Disability Rights Oregon. I work with the Mental Health Rights Project, which has two basic goals. One is to support policies that keep people with disabilities integrated in our communities rather than incarcerated and institutionalized, and the other goal is to support people's basic rights when they are institutionalized or incarcerated. During the past year, we've really reached a capacity crisis at the state hospital, and that crisis is driven by a dramatic increase, a doubling in the past 10 years of the people who are charged with a crime and who, because of mental illness or another disability, are not competent to aid and assist in their own defense. 66% of patients who are ordered to the state hospital for competency restoration treatment are homeless prior to their arrest. And the state hospital costs $1,300 per person per day. So I just want you to sit with that figure for a minute and imagine, if you had a loved one who had a behavioral health need and didn't have a place to live, what could you do to impact their lives with $1,300 per person per day? It's a huge, huge amount of money. And what's happening is the state hospital, the funds that we should be using in our communities to end houselessness and expand access to behavioral health care instead being sucked into the vortex of the state hospital. That leads me to my question, which I'm going to read. In Multnomah County, there's broad agreement, at least in theory, that low-level mental health-related behaviors should not be criminalized. And yet, we continue to warehouse people with mental illness in jail for charges like trespass, disorderly conduct, misuse of 911, or probation violations. What are the practical tools that you would commit to implementing in your first 100 days in office to effectively decriminalize mental illness?
Thank you. So, not only are the crimes you listed, prosecuting our office, I looked at the district attorney's budget for the last year, and 13% of all the cases they prosecuted were trespass. I mean, the vast majority, a lot of the cases that they're prosecuting are the types of cases that you discussed. In my current role, I worked this past session to get legislation passed called the Impacts Grant. That's going to invest over $10 million across the state. It's going to focus on exactly the types of people who are cycling in and out of our jails and in and out of our emergency departments. A lot of folks in that their stories are described in your report, the unwanteds. Those types of cases where they're too sick to be in the hospital, too sick to be in the hospital, too sick to be in the jail, and they end up being dropped off at a bus stop in the middle of the night. It's not acceptable. And the same thing for people being held in our jails. When the average punishment for trespass for anybody who would be normally get a sanction, like 1 to 2 days in jail, if maybe not even that. But if somebody can't aid and assist, they end up spending 30, 60, 90, even more days in jail. That's just not right fundamentally. And so we need to dismiss those cases. You should not just sit in jail because you're unable to aid and assist. We need to think for what other alternatives and ways can we do that. And I think looking to grants like the one that I helped get passed in this past legislature, there's going to invest in people who have these behavioral health needs. We saw that 9% of the people booked into our jails use 30% of our jail beds. They're 150% more likely to be in our emergency departments and 650% more likely to have the behavioral health, mental health, and co-occurring diagnoses. We need to be investing in the wraparound services that they need and not using the criminal justice system to ration our health care. That is not a smart way to use our resources. So community investment, like you talked about, not $1,300 a day in the state hospital. Don't charge those cases, and let's look for alternatives that are outside the criminal justice system.
At its core, this is a service issue. I mean, when Ronald Reagan started shutting down institutions decades ago, that created a humanitarian crisis that we're still dealing with. I mean, that's what this is at its core. And so, when we look at the criminal justice system, the issue becomes, I believe, how can we connect services to the system? I mean, I don't think with low-level offenses, virtually anyone, certainly not myself, would say that we're looking for convictions. I mean, the goal should be when people come into the system, we try and get them to community-based services. Now, the mental health court is an example I mentioned at the beginning, where you have people who are charged with crimes. If they're back in the state system, they're back locally, but we have a probation officer who helps get them, assisted housing, helps get them treatment, helps get them to a place at a community-based level that works. But it's going to take more services, too. The county's starting to get this. We have a new clinic that's going to open up downtown at some point in the future. But the key is marrying up that piece of the criminal justice system with providing services, because the other piece of this is, we can just dismiss these or have people do a couple days in jail and send them on their way. But we're going to see a lot of these folks again. And the goal ultimately should be, as I said at the beginning, to get folks out of the system. The folks that account for those high numbers of arrests in some way to get them out. And it's an evolving process. It's not an easy answer. But what I want to do is start thinking about how can we use that contact point with the system to get people going in a better direction and get them access to true services.
Sarah, I want to thank you for that question. That is very personal for me. I watched my uncle go through that exact process you described. He passed away recently, but he was schizophrenic and had multiple interactions with law enforcement throughout his life. And the one that the most recent one, he actually stole sandwich meat from Fred Meyer, and I'm simplifying it a lot, but through a following series of events ended up spending 60 days in the Oregon State Hospital on an eating assist issue. So when I tell you that this issue is personal for me, that is why. There are, in terms of practical tools that the district attorney can use and implement, there are two critical points that I can see where the system really failed him, and that was at the initial charging decision to charge that case, and then again when they made the decision to send him to the state hospital. And so for me, those are the 2 points that I would like to focus on, and in the office, look at, is this, when we make a charging decision, is this charge going to further harm our community or this individual? And if the answer is yes, then we should not be doing it.
Hi, my name is Willa Sinclair. I use
she, her pronouns. I am here on behalf of Decrim Oregon, which is a newly formed movement working to create a pathway towards the decriminalization of sex work here in Oregon and eventually across the United States. So this question might come off a little lengthy. I want to really make sure to explain some points in asking this question so that the audience might have a little bit more understanding of the question being asked. I want to start out by stating that Oregon has a very long history of protecting the rights of the most privileged sex workers, specifically speaking about strippers, and the way that fully nude dancing is protected by Oregon law under First Amendment rights and has been for somewhere around 30 plus years. However, full-service sex workers who are colloquially known as prostitutes, which is an outdated and horriphobic term that people should stop using, they have come under attack on a national level. Specifically, we look at the two bills that were passed in 2017, FOSTA and SESTA. We look at these bills in the way that they've led to the criminalization of and further violence for full-service sex workers, a large percentage of whom are queer and trans, and specifically Black trans women, who we know are one of the groups in society that face the most violence and murder rates in the country. So, all of that being said, it's important to recognize that these bills and the legislature, like it, use the guise of fighting sex trafficking to do nothing but further muddy the understanding we have, and we know to be true, that sex workers and sex trafficking victims are not synonymous and should not be treated like they are. So, that being said, some of you say that you're in favor of not prosecuting sex workers and prostitution-related charges, but we know that what we need is the full decriminalization of sex work. I want to clarify that we are not looking for the legalization of sex work, nor are we looking for the criminalization of the purchasing of sex work while we continue to criminalize prostitution or decriminalize prostitution acts. We're looking for the full decriminalization of sex work. So, two-part question. First part is a simple yes or no answer, and that's all that's needed. The second part is an opportunity for you to expand. So, are you in favor of the full decriminalization of sex work? Yes or no? And what does decriminalization in that process look like to you?
So I'm going to start with the second part. In U.S. Attorney's Office, we do a lot of work in human trafficking. And I've long thought that we disproportionately, in the state system, prosecuted prostitution, sometimes not Johns, in that system. What concerns me about outright decriminalization, although frankly it's something I would think about and want to hear more about, is that overlap between trafficking and others who are not trafficking. Because what we're seeing increasingly with the use of the internet in the human trafficking cases is extraordinary manipulation and abuse and really horrendous criminal activity. And so my concern is not creating an environment or a loophole legally that those, not sex workers, but those who are manipulating them can exploit further more than what we already have right now. So I know you'd love to give me, I'm supposed to give a yes or no answer, but based on what I know, and I need to learn more, I can't say that yes, this is absolutely a good idea, because I see a lot of human trafficking cases where the impacts on people's lives are extraordinary, and it's getting worse and worse with the proliferation of the internet and the use of the sex trades.
Sorry, before we hear other responses, just want to acknowledge, please address our community members, the way they asked to be addressed, which is with a yes or no response, and then your follow-up. Thank you.
Okay, well, full decriminalization, at this point, no. But I really appreciate your question, and I wish that I could say yes. I think that this question raises real serious problems when we have the law being used as a tool sometimes to silence the voices of sex workers, and that it can prohibit the reporting of crimes. So I think that this issue is very important, and I would echo needing to learn more myself. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing this space with us and bringing this issue to us.
And I want to work, and I want to know more, and I want to learn from your organization and the community that's being affected. When you talked about trans women of color and the violence that they face, that makes me angry every time that I wake up and see yet another person who has lost their life. So this issue is very important, and at this point, I wish I could say yes, but I have to say no.
So on full decriminalization, I'm also not there yet. This is an issue, like my co-panelists have said, that I want to learn more about. But I am very concerned about people being trafficked and figuring out who is who is consensual sex workers and who's being trafficked, and especially on the John side of things, on the people buying sex. I think we have to learn more about how to figure out ways that we're not going to incentivize trafficking. So I have no interest in prosecuting people who are voluntarily entering and working as a sex worker, getting them treatment, resources, and things if they need those things would be something that would be a priority. But at this point, learning more about how that intersects with trafficking is something that I need to learn more about before I committed to full decriminalization.
I do have a quick follow-up here. Firstly, I want to outline the ways that the decriminalization movement is not brand new in the United States. I am, to be honest, a bit unsurprised at the responses received and a little bit surprised at the lack of understanding of what decriminalization law looks like that is being pushed across the country right now. Specifically in DC, they are working on a bill being passed that will support the full decriminalization of sex work while still retaining all laws that criminalize sex trafficking. I really want to highlight the importance for everyone in the room to understand that there is not a single ounce of overlap between sex workers and sex trafficking victims. Specifically, when we talk about sex workers, we are talking about consenting adults who choose to sell sexual activity, sexual touch, things of this nature for financial means and for also resources, because a lot of sex work looks like trade and not necessarily a strict transaction. I think it is important for us to also recognize the ways that Johns, who are clients, because not all people who purchase sex are men, it's important when we talk about sex work clients to recognize that when we're talking about sex work, we're talking about two consenting adults being both the client and the sex worker. And when we look at the ways that legislation like what you're suggesting, where there is not full decriminalization, but instead a focus on the client, such as the Nordic model, still results in a large wave of sex trafficking victims being overlooked because they are continuing to be pushed underground. When we talk about the internet, we should also talk about the ways that any type of criminalization leads to further marginalization and people being pushed underground. The comparison that I always use when educating folks is looking at what the Prohibition did when we pushed alcohol underground, and the ways that we have underground online channels the same way that they had underground ways of producing and selling alcohol, but the recognition that we have an opportunity here to be able to create laws that decriminalize consensual sex work, which is its own separate thing, while still holding space to create avenues for the prosecution of those who would create victims and push them unwillingly into the sex trade industry and therefore creating sex trafficking victims. So these things are not synonymous in any way whatsoever. So all of that context being said, the only follow-up question that I have for you is, how are you committing to reaching out to sex worker communities, and what have you done so far to do that?
Sorry, I want to make sure I have your question.
The question specifically is, how are you going to reach out to sex worker communities, and what have you done so far to do that?
So, how am I going to reach out? Well, I I'm going to call you, I think is what I'm going to do. That's going to be the first step. And then in terms of looking at this office and creating a space that the community can come and be involved in, that's how it continues, once the campaign is over. And then to your second question, what have I done so far in this campaign? To be totally honest, I have not done anything. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have, which is why I'm glad that you're here and I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation.
Yeah, today I haven't talked to anybody in that community, but I absolutely would like to and like to learn more. And I appreciate the comments that you shared because I think I'm already thinking about these things and I'd like to learn a lot more. So I will reach out and see what else I can learn.
Likewise, on the first part of the question, I'll reach out as well to members of the community you think that we're speaking to about this issue to educate myself. To your second question, what have I done today? I've worked with the human trafficking folks and understand that perspective. And I know it's different, you alluded to that in your question, but I understand the concerns and perspective there. And I've looked at some other countries historically that decriminalized some sex work to try to understand what those models look like, not that that's the same thing.
Okay, you know that if you become elected, you're going to be a public figure. And I didn't know that he had visitors to his home. Okay, I had a friend that visited his home. He was put in jail. He had a bond that was raised outrageously high, $250,000. What you gonna do when somebody come to your home?
Well, it depends who it is, because I've actually already had people come to my home on my current job. Reporters, and then some militia folks tried to come to the house, and they were turned away. And it depends who it is and how nice they are and what they want to know. I mean, if somebody's standing looking through the back window at 2 in the morning, wanting to have a conversation, I might tell them to come to the office Monday morning. But in the past, I've had people come to my house. If they're polite on the street, I'll talk to them. I mean, I think, hey, look, I mean, this is kind of what you sign up for. I mean, I believe being civil and polite to everyone, so I don't like people yelling and that kind of thing. But if somebody wants to have a conversation, it's kind of part of the deal with running for office.
Thank you. I think I agree mostly with what Ethan said, and when you sign up and you put yourself out there, you expose yourself to a lot, but you get the opportunity to reach out and meet people in your community, and that's what this is about, and that's what this should be about. So if somebody wants to come to my home, I will absolutely talk to them and use that opportunity to get to know them. I think that's the best answer that I can give you.
Yeah, I agree. With my co-candidates here, they'll have to wade through some toys and move some, maybe rake some leaves or something while they're there. But, in general, that is part of the job, and as long as it's a cordial conversation, we're being friendly, and, it's not like what Ethan said, with militia members coming to his house, but it's people who want to engage in conversation, and, I think that is part of being a public figure, and so just treating people with respect like I would do anywhere else.
Hi. Sorry I haven't been up here the whole time. There's a little bit of a accept. But yeah, I'm going to let Sarah ask her follow-up question before I ask mine.
So if I could circle back to my topic about mental health. I was thinking, Ethan, about your response, like using an arrest as an opportunity to get people connected to services, and that's actually a rationale that I've heard a lot, like that police officers make an arrest because they want to help, and then, the person gets sent to the state hospital because they're trying to get help for this person, and the judges want to help, and there's really, from my perspective, there's no evidence that the criminal legal system actually has delivered the help that people are conceptualizing. And so I just wonder, I wonder if you can speak to, any, your kind of explanation, like, is the criminal legal system really a ticket to help, or could we provide that help without, paying lawyers, paying court costs, paying for the cost of incarceration, could we shift those resources to the help and just bypass the criminal legal system?
Well, I think the answer to your question, if we're focused on convictions, the answer, of course, is no, right? I mean, it becomes a question of what is the paradigm and what is the proper view of mental health in the criminal justice system. I think there's gradually been a change there. And secondly, though, I think at a very practical level, we are seeing people who come into our jails and they are getting arrested who have acute mental health issues. And that's going to continue to happen. I mean, and I believe strongly we don't criminalize mental health per se, but we are going to see folks who have these issues. So then it becomes, what can we do to educate ourselves as lawyers, as judges, as police officers, especially who do not have background in mental health typically, and have those first encounters? What can we do so that that education exists so that we can exploit that opportunity to do something? It's not perfect, but I think pragmatically, we are going to see contact with the system with folks who have acute issues. And I want to produce and create and support a system that best addresses that contact in that moment.
So I think, the question about, I think the question is about shifting resources. Did I hear that? I want to make sure I got your question.
Yes, just that, despite the good intentions of lots of the players in the system, the system doesn't appear to be resulting in help. So if especially with low-level charges, if the desired outcome is helping people improve their situations, could we shift resources and get right to the help and avoid the criminal system?
I think absolutely the next district attorney should be out there advocating for more resources for those, for the populations that are right now, over-policed and over-prosecuted in terms of the mental health issues. And the, kind of what I've been thinking a lot about in terms of this issue is that, doctors take an oath to do no harm. And, as it relates to public safety, I think that prosecutors should take a similar oath to do no more harm, at minimum, right? That is the least that we can do. And we need to, I think it's more complicated than that. I think that's kind of an easy thing to say. But when we have district attorneys who are only focused on prosecutions and the number of prosecutions, we are missing out on the point that this is, this system is supposed to provide public safety for our community, and how can we look at prioritizing our community in that system?
So I think we should look for every opportunity we can to not call the police in those situations, and to have some other service like in Eugene where they have the cahoots model. I think that's what we should be looking at is who can we call out that is actually best suited for this situation. And frequently the answer to that question is not a police officer. And then what happens is once the police officers make the arrest and they write a report, the district attorney's office just reads the report and they get about a paragraph summary of what happened, and then they file the charges. And then the charges are filed, and then the person doesn't or does show up for court, and then the case is launched. And there's just no way, the train gets rolling down the tracks, and that's where we are today. We need to think of ways to actually look at what is the problem we're trying to solve and dispatch the appropriate resources. And I think frequently that's not police officers. And in other cases too, like the lead model for people who are caught with controlled substances. Skip the whole jail and arrest thing. Let's go straight to treatment. And let's get you hooked up with a caseworker that can help you navigate the system. If I think the next DA ought to look at how many less of those cases. That should be a metric we're judging them on. How many less cases in those types that you described are being put through our system.
Hi, thank you. I'm Madeline Carroll, and I'm here just representing the organizers of the Oregon Day for the People campaign. We have a question that we sort of crowdsourced among the members, and also that has also been brought up by a member of the audience as well, so we wanted to make sure that we covered it now. So I'll try to make sure that I ask it in a way that also uses some of the wording here from the audience member. So a little bit of context, because a lot of people don't know anything about the Oregon District Attorneys Association. I didn't know anything about it until I started doing work around the powers of the district attorney. It's an association, a professional association of all of the district attorneys in Oregon and all of their prosecutors that work under them. It has an obscene amount of power. And it has often proved an insurmountable hurdle in trying to make our state's criminal legal system more equitable and humane. They opposed doing away with non-unanimous juries. We're the only state that still does that for a long time. Now they're on board because it's looking inevitable that it's going to happen. So they have held tight to the bargaining power of mandatory minimum sentences. Both of these things amplify the disproportionate harm done to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant communities in our state, and definitely in Multnomah County. They also pour money into efforts to defeat any candidate or proposed legislation that would mitigate their power. And they isolate elected DAs who do call for progressive change. So that's something that you all will be up against if you get elected based on your answers to our questions so far. One other example that I know Donna wanted to make sure that I mentioned was that recently they invited the former DA from Ferguson, Missouri to speak at their annual conference. This is the man who declined to prosecute the police officer who killed Michael Brown. During his presentation, he mocked the ACLU and the Black Lives Matter movement, and he showed a photo of a group of Black people standing together and said, this is a quote, "This is what we're dealing with." Our question starts with a yes or no. If you're elected, will you diminish the ODAA's power by removing the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office from that organization and asking other district attorneys to join you in doing that? And after you answer that question, whether or not you choose to do that, how will you work to diminish the power of the Oregon District Attorneys Association, either from the inside or the outside?
So, to the answer to your first question is yes. You know, I heard about that conference. I didn't go because of my past experiences at those conferences. But I heard about it, and I heard that there were members of the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office who did leave that conference because of the issues that you brought up. And then I want to get to the second part of your question. In terms of working to diminish the power, you know, that's going to take more than just me. I'm going to need the help of everybody in this room and all of these organizations. You know, I think I just sort of wanted to take a minute to emphasize some of the problems that you're talking about, and having heard about the kind of the way in which they have stood in the way of reform is really frustrating, and again goes to how little trust the communities can have in the district attorney's office when those types of things are happening. So what's really important is races like this that are that where we have a race and we can, we can help to highlight the power that this office has, and also the power that the office has across the state, and that ODA has. So I think that that's really important, and I'm really glad that you brought it up.
First, to answer your question is yes. I would absolutely agree with the District Attorney's Association. It's not unprecedented in this community. In fact, Multnomah County's only been a member of ODA for the last 8 years. My trunk was not a member of Oregon District Attorney's Association, and I don't know this from talking to him, but it's my, from what I've heard, it's because he was the DA of Multnomah County. He represented the people of Multnomah County, and that's the office that I'm running for, is to represent the people of Multnomah County, not a statewide association of district attorneys. I have worked in criminal justice reform in Salem for the last 6 years. And I know firsthand the power of the District Attorneys Association. And sometimes they will come to the table and they'll work with you and be collaborative, and sometimes they absolutely won't. When I worked on legislation in 2017 to bring the punishment from felony possession of a controlled substance from a felony to a misdemeanor, because we made the case that it was having a disparate impact on our communities of color, the sheriffs wrote a letter saying that the collateral consequences were unjust. The chiefs of police wrote a letter saying that the collateral consequences were unjust. The District Attorneys Association opposed that change. And they said, there's no reason we would ever do this, at this point in our history. So absolutely, I have worked with and opposing to the Oregon District Attorneys Association throughout my time working on criminal justice reform. My focus will be on what's right for Multnomah County. And if not being a part of that association is the right thing to do, I'm absolutely there. I would absolutely work with other district attorneys to bring them, because I've had closed-door conversations with other elected district attorneys. And on the issues that you cite, mandatory minimums, on non-unanimous juries, there are other district attorneys that are willing to go into some of those places. And I think we need to have those conversations and create a space that's safe for them to come out, and we can actually have a more robust conversation around the state. So absolutely.
I think the answer is no, you don't leave if you want to change what they do. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. I mean, the reality is the DA in this county represents the people of this county. And if we want to change the direction on some of these key issues, you need to be part of that organization as the largest district attorney's office in the state. Because when they take a public position on something like non-unanimous juries, that should absolutely have been different from the outset. And I've been saying that for a while as someone who practices with unanimous juries in federal court. You need to be able to be in the room to direct that conversation and to lead. And that's what that is about, and that is what being the DA of this county in this state is about. And so it's easy to sit outside the room and take a principled position, but it's not going to help any of us if they go a direction that isn't sufficiently in line with the values of this county.
We have a little more time than expected, so we're going to use that time to answer some of the questions that have come out from our community members. We're going to start with a question from Justice Advocates. If you want to come up and answer.
I'm Sally Jochen, member of Justice Advocates, a small grassroots group, and our main issue has been repealing mandatory minimum sentences in Ohio. And what we try to do is educate people out in the community by doing different kinds of programs to let people know how things could be changed. So I would like to ask this question to all of you. If you become DA, is your office going to continue threatening a mandatory minimum sentence in order to coerce defendants into accepting plea agreements?
For our responses this one?
Well, I think that if the question is will we continue to charge Measure 11 in certain cases like rape, sex abuse 1, and robbery 1, I think the answer is yes. In my experience, after doing this for 2 decades, there are some offenses, raping a child, murder, setting a fire that's intended to kill people, that deserves a serious, significant prison sentence. Where I feel there is space to work with mandatory minimums is ensuring that people don't get caught up in Measure 11 around the periphery, that we don't charge the person who's the getaway driver in a car with robbery in the second degree and send them away for 70 months if they haven't had contact with the system, those misuses of that statute. And so what I would do is try and continue to be thoughtful about the historical disproportionate impact some of those sentencing laws have on people in our community and use them effectively. But I can tell you, in my experience, there are a small group of people who went into the spectrum, particularly with sex offenses, who deserve a prison sentence that should be consistent and fair and equal across the board.
So yeah, I want to answer your question directly in terms of, we have Measure 11 currently, and on day one, I will be in favor of reserving it for the most serious offenses. But until we can talk about what we're going to do to replace it, I don't think I can say that my office will never charge it. We need to work towards a system that holds offenders accountable, that provides judicial discretion, and we need to work towards that system. But in no way can I sit up here and say that I'm not going to do that.
I support the repeal of mandatory minimum sentencing. It's a policy that was passed 25 years ago. It's time to look at it again. As a person who looks at research and data, a one-size-fits-all sentence for no matter who you are or what your situation is makes no sense. It's shifted all the authority over to the prosecutors, and we shift it back to the judges to put our adversarial system back the way it should be, where the prosecution argues for what they think is right and just, and the defense argues their client's best interest, and the judge makes a decision. I think that's the way that our system should be. 70% of the people convicted of mandatory Measure 11 crimes in this state do not have a felony criminal history. These are largely people who have only been convicted of either low-level misdemeanors or no felony history whatsoever, and when they hit the mandatory minimums, and like you described, they are forced with a decision to either plead for a lesser sentence or risk going to trial for the whole sentence. We should repeal that law.
Well, I appreciate you all speaking about your opinions about mandatory sentencing. I actually asked some very specific question that I'm not hearing the answer to, which is because people are saying that people are coerced into plea bargaining because they are threatened that if you don't take this plea, we're going to try to get you a mandatory sentence. And this is what my question is. Do you approve of threatening people, and if you were the DA, having your office be allowed to threaten people with a mandatory or a long sentence in order to coerce them into a plea bargain? That's my specific question.
I think fundamentally, no, I don't approve of coercing people to take a plea, but I want to make that clear. I do think the issue that you're speaking to, though, about the leverage that prosecutors have over individuals, I've seen that firsthand representing people. I had a client who decided to go to trial on several Measure 11 charges, and it was very hard. She had no previous history and was ultimately convicted of a Measure 11 offense. So when we talk about kind of this coercive process, I agree that there are some serious problems. And as district attorney, I think that we need to, really reserve that, the Measure 11, the current system, because I'm not going to pretend that I can come in here and repeal Measure 11 on day one. We need to reserve those sentences for the most serious offenses. And then we need to work to find an alternate system that I was talking about earlier.
So we shouldn't be threatening people, especially if it's conduct that we can't prove. I mean, file the charges that are provable, that you can absolutely take to court. And then there is the plea negotiation process where you say this is what you'll get if you plea and this is what you get if you go to trial. That's the normal course of business, but we shouldn't be using that as a threat. It is inherently a coercive process, but we should give people an opportunity if they're taking responsibility early on in the process and give them, figure out ways to not hit them with the full brunt of the law. And especially with Measure 11, I mean, that's the case. We should be looking at what are the root causes of these issues and give them the treatment and the help that they need if that's what they need. Hold people accountable, absolutely, but not using it as as leverage in some sort of trumping up charges type of way or threatening that you'll bring on more charges. Absolutely not acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, you don't threaten anyone in the criminal process, that's unethical. You charge people with the crimes they've committed, with the appropriate crimes. That's kind of been my philosophy for 20 years.
I would push back on the idea that we don't threaten people.
I say that aspirationally. I mean, like any of these issues, we know we've made tremendous mistakes over generations and decades and years in the system. But I believe strongly that we should affirmatively say we shouldn't do that or don't do that.
Yeah. We also know that if all charges went to trial, then the system would crumble because they don't actually have the resources to do that, and so that we're using plea deals as a way to keep the system churning instead of actually allowing people their day in court.
So we have time for one more audience question, and just for the folks in the audience, we wanted to make sure that you all know that we will be submitting these questions to the three candidates, and candidates, do we have your confirmation that you'll respond to the rest of these questions? And we'll publicize their responses. So again, sorry that we don't have time to answer every single one, but our last question, conviction on many charges can expose immigrants and refugees to immigration-related consequences, including detention and deportation, which have devastating impacts on people and communities. As a district attorney, would you commit to taking those possible immigrant consequences into account when making charging decisions?
Couple different pieces. First, so I support Oregon's sanctuary law, which has been in place since 1987, that ensures that status alone is not a reason for contact with law enforcement. To the extent the law allows it, I would permit any of these factors to be considered in charging. Legally, you can't usually consider a person's status, race, ethnicity, any factor in a charging decision. But I think it's something that we should bring and ensure that the court knows for any sentencing or disposition decision, so that the court is fully aware of the background of any individual and the impact that a sentence may have on them, their community, their family, or anyone around them.
So I think the question that I heard was about whether the DA should take that into account, and I think absolutely that should be taken into account. The consequences that someone who may not have status, with a criminal conviction is so much greater. And so I think that's really important, and I think that to the extent that the prosecutor can take those into consideration when engaging in that plea process that we were just talking about, we absolutely need to do that.
And I agree. We should absolutely take that into consideration. In fact, I'd go one step further. I think that the district attorney's office ought to retain the services of an immigration lawyer, so that their deputy DAs can actually go and ask questions and understand, hey, if this person is convicted or discharged, what is that likely to be as an immigration consequence? The district attorney of Denver actually has a great policy on this. I would adopt the Denver district attorney's policy where she says, look, if two people steal a loaf of bread and the punishment for one person is a $50 fine, the other person gets deportation, that's not the same thing. That's not treating people equally. So So we need to figure out and take those things into consideration. I think the way that you can be sure that you do that is that you get good legal advice within your office. And so engaging the help of an immigration attorney to help us make those decisions and write those policies, I think is crucial to upholding this pledge.
Thank you. And we're going to squeeze in one more question just with 30-second response. So the question is, have you read the Portland Police Bureau audit undergone in response to Don't Shoot PDX and Teresa Rayford's organizing? And if not, will you commit to doing so? And then what is your plan to repair harm caused by the Portland Police Bureau's racist profiling that audit revealed?
So I haven't read it yet, but I will absolutely commit to doing so. My agency, like I said at the outset, looks at racial profiling. We're going to be putting out a report in the next month or two exactly on that topic. I think this is an area where we need to track data and hold police officers accountable. So I'll read that report and look at those recommendations.
Yes, no, I have not read it. I will commit to reading it, and then, and we'll commit to providing a response at that time once I have a chance to review it.
I have not either, and I'm still committed to reading it. But to the second part of your question, without having read it, I think one thing I can say that the elected DA should do is, no matter who he or she is, come January 1, 2021, is committed to being out in spaces like this, whether folks agree with him or her or not, and continue to get feedback and listen to what's gone right or what's gone wrong. Because things change and we need to learn to be flexible and open to ideas and open to the community.
I got a quick follow-up question. What does that mean? Y'all keep saying holding police accountable. If a police pull me over, physically pull me out of my car, mistreat me, and it's evident that it's done because I'm a black man, what are you going to do to that police officer to ensure that that individual doesn't do it again and other officers understand that the mistreatment of black, brown, indigenous people, LGBT community is not acceptable? Y'all keep saying, we're going to hold them accountable. If I come to you and that happened and you see it in the police report, what are you going to do?
Well, I think the elected district attorney needs to know that if somebody's stopped because of the color of their skin, that is not acceptable, and that case should not be charged. It should be dismissed at the front end if that's the basis for a traffic stop. And I think more than that, they need to be aware and they need to be communicating with different folks in the community to understand that issue, so the DA can turn around and say to the police, look, we're hearing all these things. Do you know that this is happening?
So nothing. I want to know what you're doing. I'm not trying to be rude, but listen to what you said. I'm saying as a black man, you are aware that a police officer mistreated me physically. And your response to me is, well, I'm going to talk to other cops about whether or not they know it's happening. They know it's happening. I'm saying as the DA, if you know that happened to me, you look at the information and it's evident, if I did that to an officer, you would say that you would charge me. So what I'm saying is, at what point am I protected from the police officers when it's evident that they mistreat me?
I'm going to get into the weeds to try and address your question. I mean, there's two pieces of it legally apart from the talking to the community piece. The first is obviously if that traffic stop or that contact is based on something that's illegal, you shouldn't be charged with a crime. The second piece is if there's conduct by the police that may be problematic, then maybe that should be referred to an outside agency. I don't know how the police oversight committee is currently functioning, but that should be separately investigated. That's the concrete, tangible step that I think needs to be taken in that circumstance.
So, I think if a law enforcement officer is committing a crime, then they need to be held accountable in the same way that we are holding other people accountable in our community.
I absolutely agree with that. If it's a crime, then we're going to prosecute that crime. If it doesn't meet the level of crime, then I think going to the independent police review or the processes that are set up, and then also knowing that that officer in the scenario you described, where he's pulling you over, you're a black man, and then he's treating that way, we can't use that officer anymore in cases as a witness because we know he's biased, and therefore we know we can't trust what his testimony is going to be. So we're going to say, hey, on future cases, we can't call this officer.
Thank you.
Thank you. That will be our last question. I want to give a huge amount of gratitude to everyone who came to ask those questions, to the community members who showed up and contributed their questions and their presence. I want to thank the candidates as well for being here and giving us their responses. We didn't expect that there would be perfect alignment in our priorities, but do want you to know we're going to be there every step of the way, pushing you and holding you accountable, both to the things you promised and to the things you believe need to be changed that you not agree with at this point. I wanted to note a couple of things just that were said that irked me a little bit. One being a sense that we decide whether to prosecute based on whether that conviction will be harmful to a person. I think we need to understand that all convictions are harmful, that to detain someone and take away their freedom, put them in a cage, is an act of violence. That state violence has been normalized to the extent that we don't see it that way anymore, but anytime someone is prosecuted, that's a judgment that the violent act of removing their freedom is justified. And so we want to be real about that and what the actual experience of being detained is. I appreciated your willingness to say if someone came to your house, as long as there was a friendly discourse, you'd be open to conversations. I'd also want to encourage you to get comfortable with the idea of people being angry. That you're justified and expecting people to be polite in the way they express the ways that they've been harmed by the system that you're running. If you win, is an entirely, I think, unreasonable expectation. And with that, we'll pivot a little bit to the audience. This is the Oregon DA for the People campaign has been a small and mighty group that's done a lot of amazing work and is beginning to expand really rapidly. And we would love to have you involved in that work moving forward. There are a lot of ways we can plug in, a lot of specific needs we have to make sure that we continue amplifying the voices of the folks who have borne the brunt of police and prosecutorial violence. We are definitely in need of folks who are social media experts to support us in getting our message out. We need folks who are excited about event planning, excited about door knocking, excited about public education. So some of our main goals are, one, to continue building power with especially the folks who have experienced this violence so that their voices are the ones leading this movement. We want to continue to put pressure on the DA candidates. And we want to build a movement that can extend beyond this election so that we are then positioned from day one of the next DA's administration to be there, remembering the promises that were made, remembering where we saw some gaps in what we believed and what they believed, and chipping away, holding them accountable, showing up, making it impossible to ignore what the priorities of the community are. As we're leaving, thank you. Before I say that, we're also we're passing a hat around that will be benefiting Portland Freedom Fund, doing super crucial work of bailing out our Black community members. So if you have cash with you, please do contribute what you're able. There's a basket by the door. If you don't have cash with you, you can make donations on Portland Freedom Fund's website. Is that? Yeah, portlandfreedomfund.org. Beyond that, there are a number of folks with clipboards. Ty and I have clipboards. There are other folks with yellow armbands that have clipboards. Find one of us on the way out so that you can put your name down to continue to get information for us and let us know how you want to get involved.
If you're excited, we'd love to see you at our Orientation for Review campaign organizers Sunday, November 3rd, 6 p.m. You can come back.
Where is it?
It'll be at DCDC. Yeah. DCDC, which is on Killingsworth.
14 Northeast Killingsworth.
Thank you, 14.
You're welcome.
And we have food outside. We can't bring food or drink into the chapel, but you're welcome to stay, grab food, talk to a neighbor, make new connections so we can keep building power together. Thank you all so much.